Welcome back to another Boxscore Geeks show. It has been a week, Brian. It has been a week. It's been a year. A friend of mine summed it up succinctly saying, "We have a year for the NBA in which Kobe Bryant died in a helicopter crash. And a month later, that is not even close to the top story of the year. And had anybody told me that at any point in my blogging career, I would not have believed them. So here we are. We have been dealing, of course, with the coronavirus and all of the craziness in the world. To date ourselves, we are recording what, March 24th, March 25th.
Yeah, March 24th.
March 24th. If you're from the future, this was basically when a bunch of states started doing the stay-at-home measures in response to the coronavirus, while simultaneously having our president say it was still no big deal, except it was a big deal, except it wasn't, except we're doing great. Dear God, I hope that's all a distant memory to some of you, and that things have improved and that you're not listening in some desolate wasteland and going, dear God, the only thing we could find was a mini disc player with a bunch of old Boxscore Geeks podcast shows, and that's all we have for entertainment. And if that happened, oh my God, I'm sorry. But such is the world. But we are going to try and flippantly discuss the NBA and NBA stories and stuff like that, Brian. Kind of keep to our normal stuff. When you and I kind of talked offline about coming back to do the show, I kind of said, for my sanity and normalcy, I kind of wanted some of this, which is selfish. I actually confess that. But when everything's kind of going weird, when daycare's closed, when everybody's work from home, when everything, when your wife's school is shut down, sometimes you just want to cling to something that's a little normal. And this podcast has been something we've been doing for years now, and you said you were okay with that, so I appreciate that for what it's worth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish we could have come back sooner, but I've been telling you this before the show. I just don't have a lot to say right now. Like, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts myself, other ones, and whenever they talk about COVID, I just skip past them. Like, I don't want to hear what random people have to say about it. So I'm going to try not to talk about it too much myself and stick to the NBA. But just to say that, yeah, I've been quarantined 2 weeks already here in California. And the rest of the country, I guess, is starting to catch up. So it's probably going to be at least another 2 weeks for me here. And probably more. So, we'll see what happens. I guess the only silver lining that I can see is I'm hoping that this will mean, people will get back to respecting government and science, and that it just doesn't all run itself. And we actually need to, run it well to avoid, millions of people dying. And we're at a crossroads right now where we're going to make that decision or not. And today's a little bit scary. Today, there's rumblings that we want to open things up earlier than we should. I just don't see that happening. I think things are going to deteriorate quickly and things are going to stay closed. So, yeah, we're in this for the long haul, and that's everything I have on the COVID.
I think, yeah, let's stick with. Actually, that's funny because one of our stories is about how to be pessimistic on sports. Because I'm like, okay, well, let's detract from that by talking about sports. And here's what I'm going to say. Let's put the bad news at the end. So, we'll make a bad news sandwich. We started the show with the bad news. We're going to end the show with the bad news, which is where I'm going to tell you why I don't think the 2019-20 season completes in any way, shape, or form. And I have some good thoughts on that. To your point on COVID stuff, listen to the experts, be careful about self-analysis. That's kind of all you got. And I think you're right, I think as kind of a meta point, and why I'm not surprised in a pessimistic way, is for years we've been doing advanced analytics with basketball. And for years I've joked, I forget where we've ended up, because I think some of the popular phrases I like using have been co-opted by like alt-right podcasts. But, I've been very curmudgeonly about advanced analytics, particularly in basketball. And the reason, honestly, has been that there have been people that have analyzed the numbers, one in particular, Dave Barry, with very boring and routine methods that are not all that complicated. In Dave Barry's case, it's just standard econometrics and we harp this every couple of shows, but David Berry is a professor of economics at Southern Utah University, tenured. He's written a textbook on sports economics. He teaches econometrics. That's something he teaches both at the undergrad and graduate level. His kind of claim to fame is that his first book, Wages of Wins, was published based on his sports economics research, and it was published by Stanford Press. He is routinely asked to speak at places like Huffington Post back in the day, Forbes, before some weirdness with the NBA happened there. I've jokingly called Dave Berry a very vanilla economist, which might extra apply because he is, a white male economist in Utah. So it's like if you're looking for kind of the most boring economist you could go with, that might be it.
I will say though, Dre, he does post his bike rides and hikes. Not very boring, wilderness and landscape out in Utah. I have to say, very exciting.
Follow Dave Berry. He's Wages of Wins
Yeah.
on Twitter and Instagram, I believe. And yeah, he's an outdoorsy person. One of my favorite pieces he wrote way back in the day was explaining why Utah was a great free market destination. His logic being he's a professor in Utah, and being a professor is very similar to a basketball player in that in theory you want bigger markets, bigger schools that pay more money. And he kind of said, hey, better air quality and a decent school with lots of outdoorsy stuff. Hey, Utah's not a bad place. So, you're like, hey, people should, NBA players should go to Salt Lake City. It's a great destination. I don't think he swayed many stars with that.
Well, hey, that was the Karl Malone thing, right? He was a big, he was supposed to be a redneck. He was like a fisherman and all that. So that's why Karl Malone liked staying in Utah all those years.
That's rough because that's a good point. But then he's also Karl Malone, as you discover about many of your quote unquote heroes, a horrible person off the court. So we'll shy away from Karl Malone. But the point being, Dave was not in any way controversial as an economist, yet if you go to Wikipedia or look him up or find basketball circles, he's considered an outspoken person in the advanced analytics community of sports economists, or just sports analytics. Earlier this year, back when things were not insane, Brian, I feel bad actually using that term because everything feels insane right now. I got some grief because I insulted the advanced analytics community by saying a lot of it is hobbyists that don't know what they're doing. But to tie it all together, we had a normal, boring economist do some very simple stuff to analyze basketball player. And his original goal was something very simple, which is just, can we track how productive NBA players are and track that against their wages and see if there are market inefficiencies? The answer was overwhelmingly yes. For what it's worth, sports are a weird world where contracts are signed weird, I keep using the word. Contracts are signed in bizarre places. So, rookie contracts don't make a lot of sense. Mike Trout at one point, I think, was making $1 million a year when he was MVP of the American League, I believe.
Because he came in so young, right, that he didn't get a chance to get paid yet. He was under team control is what they call it.
Yeah, so it gets, all of the sports get weird, and then there's restricted free agency and team rights. So a lot of times a player's contract doesn't really line up with their current year's salary doesn't really line up with the production that got them the current year's salary, if that makes any sense. But even ignoring that, the reality is the NBA is an inefficient market where people pay for the wrong stats. And all Dave Berry did was come out and say, hey, it turns out that people really are focusing on the wrong statistics when they decide what to pay foreign players. And that got people to call him outspoken and controversial. And I see all of this bad math and science and statistics that explain why he's wrong about Allen Iverson or Kobe Bryant, et cetera. And so on the one hand, it's very frustrating the world we're in right now, where you see so much bad science. And the cynical and mean view I'm going to say is I've had a decade of people that purport to be interested in complicated numbers and science and statistics. And I have seen them fall over themselves because they don't like what the numbers say and work themselves in circles to explain why their way of thinking is right. And so I am not surprised when people that don't even respect science from the get-go quickly get much worse. So it's an annoying connection. I mean, I guess the silver lining on that is it's a very human quality, which just is what it is. It doesn't make things better, but it helps explain things a little, which I guess is what it is.
Wait, so just to make sure I'm clear on what you're saying here, are you saying that you've seen the NBA analytics community respond in a disappointing way to COVID, that's carrying
No,
over, or something different than that?
so actually, thank you for making sure I'm putting this on track. So in NBA, people are like, I like numbers, I like science, I'm rational, I'm a scientist, whatever, right? And you give them some data that says, hey, something you thought was true is now false. And I have seen them go, well, that can't be right. I don't believe it. Dean Oliver in the book Basketball on Paper, one of the first major analytics books on the subject, was like, stuff doesn't pass the smell test. His argument was, I believe Wayne Winston came out with one of the first versions of adjusted plus minus, which is just a terrible line of analysis, Brian. But he came out and said, hey, our numbers say that Andrea Kirilenko is a better player this season than Shaquille O'Neal. And for what it's worth, the wins produced numbers, I believe, on that season, I forget which one it was, agree.
Kirilenko was one of the best underrated players of the era, yeah.
He's also, Utah's got a bunch of these where, if I'm not mistaken, if you look for players that were really good at three-point shots, but just didn't really take a lot. I seem to recall in his prime, Kirilenko was a pretty good from 3-point line stretch guy.
Yeah, he played 3 on 4. I think he'd be much more highly coveted in this day and age. I think he'd rightly be considered a star like we did back then. Nowadays,
he's kind of up and down on 3-point shots, but of course, then teams weren't focusing.
But he was, maybe the best defensive player in the league some years as well.
Yeah, he was amazing, and like John Stockton's another player like this where I go, oh, in the modern NBA, he might even be better. So we actually agree that Kirilenko that year was better than Shaquille O'Neal, and he got a lot of Wayne Winston for saying that got a lot of ridicule, and Dean Oliver brought up the smell test and said, hey, if things don't pass the smell test, maybe your analytics are wrong. And we've never been a fan of that take. We've certainly said, be skeptical of the numbers, check your work, always make sure you believe it. But what a lot of people in the analytics community took that to mean was, if your metric doesn't like the player you like, change it to like the players you like. As an example, get to throw some shade, Brian, which is nice because while I used to throw some shade at this person metric before, I had some nice things to say, and they are making it easier for me to have less nice things to say. So at Basketball Reference, there's a metric called BPM, box plus minus. Isn't a plus minus metric, just effing stupid. And he has a lot of problems in his metric. If you want to hear me talk ad nauseum, I think we can make a clip show of former podcasts, and it's a subject I've been meaning to write on. But then it's, very similar to a lot of other subjects. I'm like, I don't really know if I feel like writing about that. If I've got limited time to write, limited time to podcast, I don't know if that's what I want to spend a bulk of it on. But the BPM metric, they just updated their numbers, and their logic was they liked Russell Westbrook's triple-double MVP season too much. So that's not how you do this, right? If your metric really, really likes a player and you don't think it should really, really like a player, you try and see if you made a mistake in your metric, but you don't say, hey, I clearly have to change the metric up because Russell Westbrook is overrated, which just is what it is. And the first write-up of BPM, the reason I said I didn't have as much shade, was actually a good write-up. It was funny where, if this makes any sense, it was a good write-up in that it was very transparent, and that anybody with half a lick of sense in analytics could read it over and go, this is bullshit, which didn't happen, which made me very sad. The most recent write-up is worse. It is not as transparent, which makes it harder to parse while still having many of the same flaws. So anyway, just comparing the two, yeah, people in the analytics movement, when they don't like what they see here, will change stuff to make it apply. And so applying it to COVID, seeing a lot of the poor response from legislators, from U.S. citizens, et cetera, in the United States, worldwide, in fact, to this, is very similar, where you just go, people don't like this, and so they are ignoring the science, ignoring the data. But that is seems to be a very universal thing. And I'm saying I've got a cheat code in that I've even seen people in a land where they claim that they like that stuff still do it.
Yeah, and Michael Lewis of Moneyball fame, we talk about Moneyball all the time on this show. He was very prescient in writing a book. First book he wrote during the Trump era, before all this happened. It's called The Fifth Risk, I believe is the name of it. It might be the fourth or sixth risk, but I think it's The Fifth Risk. And what he does is he just digs into several federal agencies. The Department of Energy is one of them, and a couple of others. And he just tries to figure out what they do and why it's important. And I haven't read the book, but I've listened to him talk about it. And what he basically says is, yeah, these people are amazing civil servants and scientists, and what they do is incredibly difficult and hard to do. And they never talk themselves up about it. They're civil servants, right? They just sit there and do it. And the reason I bring this up is that people just tend to think that the government is just a machine that runs itself all on its own, and we just don't care. We can disassemble it. We can ignore the advice of the experts and just do whatever we want. And I mean, I think the reason Michael Lewis wrote that book is he thought something like this might happen, where if we dismantle the government enough, it's really going to come to hurt us, and a lot of people could die. And yeah, that's where we are now.
And I mean, we're both tech folk, and we are very familiar with the hubris that a lot of times it's engineers. Brian, I apologize on behalf of us.
Yeah, Elon Musk famously tweeted it's not a big deal. COVID wasn't, right? And now all of a sudden he's like, I'm going to build you a bunch of ventilators. So I'll give him credit. He changed his mind, but he did show the hubris. So sorry for interrupting.
That's the funny thing is you see engineers go, oh, this is an easy problem. We just do blah, blah, blah. And oftentimes ignore the logistics. Or one of the funnest things about hard problems is oftentimes we'll say, why did the previous person do this? It's so stupid. As an engineer, this happens all the time to me, sometimes with my own code. My own code. And I'll go, oh my God, Dre from 5 years ago, this is ridiculous. What were you thinking? You spent 2,000 lines writing this very complicated bit of software. I can redo it. I can do it in 500 lines. You took 10 files. I can do it in 2. And you bang your head against the wall for a few days, and you go, oh, that's right. I needed to do this because of blah, 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 blah. It's very, very silly. And I think, to your point on government, that happens a lot, where we'll go, this seems really stupid. And you might even be right, but then it's also not necessarily as easy to replace or upgrade as we think. And I think that is hopefully people take some of that away, at least some of the right people, because I think there are some people that won't from all of this crisis. Just respect for stuff that's hard and boring. I think people give not enough credit, exactly what you're saying. But let's get on to I do not have a soft landing to the NBA. I have been working on a piece, Brian. I really hope it gets out. Me talking about it on the podcast decreases the chance of it getting out, but at least we have that much. And what I did is I wanted to know what the hell happened in the 2015-2016 NBA season. So for those that don't remember, the reason this season stands out is if you go to Basketball Reference, something you can do, their Play Index Plus tool is amazing. So if you go to I'm trying to walk Brian through this and the audience, so play along at home. If you go to basketballreference.com/play-index, or it's on the top bar, you can go there. They have a team season finder. And so if you go to the team season finder, what you can ask for is you can ask for SRS. And it's at the very, very bottom. Their order is bad.
Oh, I've got a hot tip. There's a link that goes all the way down to the miscellaneous section up at the top. So you just click that link at the top and it'll scroll you down.
Boom. Love it. All right. If you do SRS greater than or equal to 9, and then I'm actually just going to say 3-point era. So 3-point era is 1979, 1980 on. So SRS, for those that don't know, even though we talk it like every other show, is the point margin your team is expected to win an average game against a neutral opponent. So it's strength of schedule adjusted point margin for the team. And so I looked for above 9 in the 3-point era. And in fact, if I want to be really jerky, Brian, I would really leave off 1996 and 1997. For those that don't know, the NBA for a brief period in its history shortened the 3-point line. So if you look at the 3-point line now, it kind of has 2 edges at the edge, and then it comes out. So it's like it's not quite a half circle. I don't know what you call that shape, Brian. I feel embarrassed with how much of a basketball fan I am to not know the best way to describe
half
that.
Oval? I don't know.
Well, it's like a half circle with 2 sticks that go to the end, right? Because the corner threes.
That's not an oval, is it?
Yeah, corner threes are a little closer to the basket, right, than the standard 3-point line because it's not a perfect circle. They changed that back in the day, so it was just a perfect circle, which I shortened the 3-point line by about 2 feet most places, and that was in 1996, 1997. So I don't really even count
Coincidentally, the band A Perfect Circle was charting in the mid 90s there, so that worked out pretty well.
Oh, I misunderstood what you meant by band. I did not know there was a band called Perfect Circle.
Yes,
So
you probably know their songs.
Okay, so if we look into that season though, 2015, 2016, it is the only season in the 3-point era where there have been two teams above 9 in SRS, and in fact, they placed top 11 all time in NBA history. That is the San Antonio Spurs, who won 67 games, and the Golden State Warriors, who won a still league record 73 regular season wins. And the reason the season's impressive is neither of those teams won a title, which is just freaking amazing and remarkable. And I wanted to look at why this happened. It's one of the most infamous because don't forget, the Warriors were in a 3-1 hole against the Oklahoma City Thunder and came back to win it in 7 games. And then the Golden State Warriors had a 3-1 lead against the Cleveland Cavaliers and then came back to win that series. And so, and the San Antonio Spurs lost to the Oklahoma City Thunder. And so I wanted to look at the playoffs and compare it to the regular season and go, was there an explanation for some of the stuff that happened? And one of the funniest ones to me, I think I've written an article on this before, Brian, I don't know if I'll find it for the show notes, is the San Antonio Spurs were actually supposed to lose. So this gets back to an old school Arturo Galletti theory called the six. It's like the shortened playoff theory. I forget. I think he's weird names for his theories. But Arturo Galletti, way back in the day, early days of Wages of Wins, analyzed playoff rotation and noted that most teams shortened their bench. Meaning that in the regular season, you might have 10 regular players in your rotation that play 10 plus minutes a game, right? And then in the playoffs, you shorten it. It really comes down to your top 6 players. And the reason this was really important is the San Antonio Spurs, one of the greatest teams ever. One of the reasons they were great, for instance, was they had a player called Boban Marjanovic. I hope I got the name pronunciation right, who was amazing, but he never plays more than 10 minutes a game. And he was like half a win per 48 minutes, but he only played like 7 minutes a game. He didn't play the playoffs at all. Whereas the Oklahoma City Thunder had had Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant, 2 amazing players. Steven Adams, a player we think is perpetually underrated. So they had these players, and those players got a lot more playing time. And that actually meant that the rotation of players that the Oklahoma City Thunder put out relative to their regular season was actually better than the rotation of players relative to their regular season that the Spurs put out. So that was fun to basically go, oh yeah, the Thunder were that wasn't an, it's a weird way to phrase it, right? That wasn't actually an upset. The Thunder were actually supposed to win that, and it came down to this. This is a really funny one and a mean one, Brian. It came down to coaching, and we've seen this before. Greg Popovich is probably one of the greatest identifiers of talent and best coaches in NBA history, and the numbers do back this up. For instance, in the book Wages of Wins, Dave Barry notes that Greg Popovich, actually it's Stumbling on Wins, Brian, apologies. In the book Stumbling on Wins, Dave Barry actually notes that Greg Popovich is one of the few coaches that actually seems to improve player performance. It's just one of the things you want a coach to do. But the Spurs, as weird as this sounds to say, Brian, have underperformed in the playoff relative to what we would expect. And part of that, I think we can put on Greg Popovich not really having a playoff mode, which is kind of one of the, like I said, this is one of Arturo's original theories. You have to have a playoff mode versus a regular season mode. The playoffs are a sprint. The regular seasons are a marathon. Arturo was bashing the Milwaukee Bucks last year for kind of this similar hubris. The Milwaukee Bucks against the Toronto Raptors. The Raptors were like, Kawhi, we rested you during the regular season, right? We did load management. Kawhi, go out there, do your thing. Kawhi played over 40 minutes a game. The Toronto Raptors go on to beat the Milwaukee Bucks. The Milwaukee Bucks waited till like game 4 to start playing Giannis over 40 minutes a game, and then he got injured in game 5. So Greg Popovich is one of these people that does not do proper playoff minute allocation. So that was one of the funniest parts, is that the Spurs, one of the greatest regular season teams of all time, were supposed to lose, which was a shocker. And the Thunder, despite the fact that they, blew a 3-1 lead, were actually supposed to lose to the Warriors. The Warriors with who they played were still supposed to win. And I thought that was fascinating. But the funnest part, Brian, was the finals. So here's the bad news. The Thunder, not Thunder, sorry. The Warriors were supposed to beat the Cavaliers. And in fact, that was actually a really bad series. It turned out both teams played pretty poorly. And you're not going to be shocked by this, Brian. I'm not going to say anything you're not surprised by, but it turns out that the Golden State Warriors in 2015, 2016, that really the reason they lost boiled down to three major problems. Steph Curry played horribly. Not Steven Adams. Andrew Bogut played horribly, and LeBron James played out of his mind relative to the regular season. And in fact, the bigger story to that finals too is actually LeBron James, the round before against the Toronto Raptors. LeBron James, who was an MVP caliber player that season, played out of his mind relative to the regular season. So another thing that happened, right, is I'm going to have to look at this. The Toronto Raptors were supposed to beat the Cleveland Cavaliers. The Cleveland Cavaliers were not even supposed to be in the finals, but they were because LeBron James played out of his mind. And then once they got to the finals, they were still supposed to lose, but Steph Curry and Andrew Bogut disappeared. And by the way, there's a very, very simple explanation for this. Both of those players were injured.
Oh,
And I got
yeah,
Brian's.
yeah. Sorry, that was abrupt. No, I agree. And we've talked about this a lot. The Cavaliers and Warriors played each other, four times in a row, right? And the team that was the healthiest won most of those series. And when both were healthy, the Warriors won because they had better players, right? But yeah, I mean, there was definitely a year where the Cavaliers had a ton of injuries. Kevin Love was hurt for at least one or two of those finals, I think. And that was a big deal. So, yeah. I mean, injuries matter. Injuries matter a lot.
There were two funny outcomes of that finals to me that I wasn't expecting when I first dug into the data that might be fun just kind of to remember. The first is the best game of the playoffs, in fact, finals as well, but playoffs too, was Draymond Green's Game 7 of the NBA Finals. It was the best game across all of the NBA playoffs that season, and it was by Draymond Green, which is kind of funny because Draymond Green is remembered for getting ejected in the middle of the NBA Finals and missing Game 5 when they were up 3-1, and the argument being, if he'd played Game 5 with Andrew Bogut still kind of there, they would have won. That's true, but the reality is Draymond Green played out of his mind, played better than his regular season numbers, put up the best game in the finals, and they lost really because Steph Curry and Andrew Bogut weren't there. Again, it's not their fault, it's injury. Another rough player that I examined in depth for that season that was interesting is Harrison Barnes. I recall Harrison Barnes playing horrendously in the NBA Finals, which he did, but it turned out he didn't really hurt them relative to his regular season performance because he was pretty awful in the regular season, and he's another funny story. So the previous season, Harrison Barnes is a pretty good player, right?
Yeah, his rookie year.
Oh, no, I'm saying his third year in the NBA.
Oh,
so
third year,
he
okay.
Age progression. If you bring up Harrison Barnes at the Boxscore Geeks, what you'll basically notice is I think he's a below average player his rookie year. I think average to above average player his sophomore year. The year that we are talking about is his third year. That's when they won a title, the first title, 2014, 2015. Harrison Barnes is not a star player, but a very, very good player. Wins per 48 of 150, points over par of 1.6, meaning against Harrison Barnes on an average team against an average team for a full 48 minutes would be expected to win by 1.6 points per game. 7.2 wins produced. Very good season. But in 2015, 2016, Harrison Barnes regresses, and he's worse than he was as a rookie. And there's a very simple explanation for that. If you look, Harrison Barnes, for the first 15 games of the NBA season in 2015, 2016, is playing just like he was the previous year, probably setting up to ramp up a little. Harrison Barnes gets injured, I believe, for 2 to 3 weeks. Harrison Barnes comes back and is terrible the rest of the season. So the annoying story of 2015, 2016 is it really does just boil down to injuries. And it's a rough one where the Warriors, had Harrison Barnes been healthy, oh my goodness, what they could have even been in spite of themselves, right? They won 73 games with Harrison Barnes playing terribly. If Harrison Barnes is healthy, good God, that team could have been. Additionally, Harrison Barnes, had he been healthy, in the playoffs, it wouldn't have even been a problem because the real story of the Warriors losing that finals, it's like if you have the best car in the league and 4 wheels fall off is essentially what happened to that team. That's what had to happen for them to lose. And I did find Harrison Barnes amusing, and then it was a very rough one where, Dallas gave him a big deal. We were questioning if the Warriors were going to give him a big deal. And it's a rough position to be in where you basically go, a player in a contract year looks bad. Do you want to take a risk on him? And unfortunately, the box score Geeks take has usually been no. We kind of say if you're hoping for ideal scenario to get your money's worth, it's probably best to move on. It turned out okay for Harrison Barnes. He's made good money in his career, but yeah, that injury early in the 2015-2016 season did really hurt him, and he has not really recovered since.
Yeah, and another thing that kind of derailed his progression was, well, so first of all, he started playing at power forward more. That good season in 2014-15, his third year, like you were saying, he mostly played small forward that year and then started playing more and more power forward, and then famously played power forward in the finals, right, with that death lineup. And then they kind of kept doing that the year after. And so that, playing him out of position didn't help either. And also, I think he just figured out yay points as well. He stopped playing within the Warriors office and is just like, I need to start making some buckets and getting paid. And like you said, it worked out, right? He definitely has gotten paid because he's changed to being a more selfish player.
But I mean, and it's annoying just for the billionth time that we said this on the podcast. People respond to incentives. If you're going to play a player for scoring points, right? Harrison Barnes, when he got signed by Dallas, I'm sure was well aware that he's going, listen, they're giving me a big deal because I look promising and I'm coming from the Warriors. But if I keep, on the Warriors, I can score 12 points a game and get away with it because I am behind Klay Thompson and Steph Curry and next to Draymond Green, right? But if I'm signed as the guy to a team, I better be scoring buckets, which of course he did. And then, good God, the Kings signed. The Kings don't know what they're doing. Kings are a horrible team, Brian. And the same thing with the Kings, where it's just going, you pay me to score buckets, I'm going to score buckets. If you want me to, shoot 60% true shooting and get, he's a forward, right? So maybe 4 assists a game and 2 more offensive rebounds. Absolutely, I'll do that, but you have to pay me for it, and teams will not. So it was exactly what you were saying, like Andrea Kirilenko, right? It's amusing that plus minus and the wins produced numbers, although the wins produced numbers I don't think were available that same season when Wayne Winston was issuing that. Would both say Andrea Kirilenko is better than Shaquille O'Neal, and most NBA GMs would laugh in your face and say, "What are you talking about?" And so as a result, it's like players know that. It's like if someone says, "I'm just like Andrea Kirilenko, I'm a 3-and-D guy, I do everything perfectly," and they go, we're looking for a Shaq. Well, then you do what Shaq does, and Shaq scores buckets. Now, admittedly, Shaq did it hyper efficiently because he could bulldoze himself to the rim like no one else. That's great. But if you're not a Shaq, you do what you can do.
Yeah, and in fairness to Shaq, he was a little bit older by the time Kirilenko came around. So if you were to compare them, age to age, Shaq would fare a lot better. But yeah, by that time, Kirilenko was definitely one of the best players in the league.
One story we've kind of just hit on a couple times, and I'm sure is going to come up more, is comparing Shaquille O'Neal to Zion Williamson.
Ooh, yeah.
That we're a big fan of. Paul DeVos on Twitter, DataFox21, has noted that players as big and as heavy as Zion Williamson just don't last in the NBA, and Shaquille O'Neal was one of them. So when you're talking about him
as well,
Yao Ming gets even weirder, where Yao Ming had a big international career that he played way too, a full NBA season, to Paul's point, was already probably too much for Yao. But Yao was also heavily invested in the Chinese national team, which probably furthered how quickly he deteriorated relative to what he would. But I mean, the annoying thing on Shaq, right, is like Shaq just towards the end of his career did not stay healthy. When he was in the Lakers system, Phil Jackson wisely made sure to monitor Shaq's minutes. This was we've talked about our annoyance at people getting frustrated with load management this season, going, just look back 20 years to successful teams. Teams have been doing this forever. Greg Popovich and Phil Jackson were doing load management in the 90s with Shaquille O'Neal and or I guess early 2000s. In the 2000s with Tim Duncan and Shaquille O'Neal, this isn't anything new. But it is just interesting, yeah, on Shaq, where he was older and more beat up. And that's something that we are going to, I guarantee we're going to keep bringing up with Zion because obviously, I think we had a conversation on one of our last podcasts before everything got shut down, Brian, about if Zion could potentially win Rookie of the Year from. This is a funny one, right? Mainstream Rookie of the Year is Ja Morant, who's had a very good rookie season. We don't disagree with that. And you were saying your Rookie of the Year, who now has it, like if we have to cast a ballot for Rookie of the Year now and kind of accept that the season is over, your boy Brandon Clark takes it down heartily
Easy.
with an amazing rookie season. 7 wins produced, wins per 48 of 311, 3 times as good as an average player. Freaking ridiculous rookie season per 48-minute numbers, 26.6 point, 12.9 rebounds. This guy is remarkable, and really the only thing keeping him from Rookie of the Year is, unlike a player like Ja Morant or Zion Williamson, Brandon Clark was drafted later, and because he was drafted later, he's not expected to be a starter because he doesn't get starters minutes. People don't recognize how amazing he is, but he is amazing. But we were saying that. Could Zion potentially wrestle the Rookie of the Year award away from Brandon Clark or Ja Morant? And he's actually, what's funny to us, Zion regressed a little. So he had an amazing start, but I think he was very up and down, if I recall. I think he kind of did the Joel Embiid trick, right, where his aggregate numbers were very good, his points and rebounds, but if you kind of looked at turnovers, shooting efficiency is kind of all over the place. But we were asking that point if he could overtake them. But the reason we're going to keep coming back to my guarantee in the future is it is going to be a question if he stays on the court. And the story we keep bringing up is actually Joel Embiid, noting that it is very tempting to get very excited about Zion. And I'm with you, but we haven't seen Zion play a full season and like a regular workload yet. And we're going to need to see that a bit before we christen him the next big thing, even if he is a great thing.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Anyone who comes into the league, I need to see some amount of, goodness over time first. Like Luka, we've seen enough from him, I think. But, someone like Zion, probably not yet to see what he really is.
And I would also argue the key with Luka is, as an example to Joel Embiid, hearkening back to that. So his third season, he played like 30 games, and he looked really good in his last 10. But his aggregate numbers for that season, I think, were like he was a little above average. So we were kind of saying if you average out the full season, he was an okay player, but we hadn't seen him put up a sustained season like, say, LeBron James. And whereas we have now seen Luka in year one as a rookie, he put up a sustained season that was better than, as an example, as a comparable, better than Harrison Barnes's best season with the Warriors. So we're like, absolutely, you are already a great player in the NBA. You are on the verge of being a star for the full season. That was the key, right? Because he also had an upward trajectory. So we kind of said, you've given us a full season of sustained great play, close to star level. I am very comfortable being excited about your future. And then this season, right, almost a full season of sustained MVP play. Whereas, like, even to Zion, even to Joel Embiid, it's like, well, you've been hit and miss. We haven't seen sustained greatness. So, yeah, we're going to need like 50 games at least of Zion playing great before I'm not worried. And then even then, all the data kind of says you're going to have to be really careful with him. And I don't know the answer. I mean, the load management that NBA teams are starting to do is promising. And we'll just have to see where that takes us. And I didn't have more than that, but it's just something we will be returning to. I actually do have a segue into another piece, Brian, based on that. So Zion Williamson agreed to donate some of his money to the New Orleans Pelicans staff so that they could still get paid while the NBA is shut down preemptively. I don't think we've talked about this on the show, but for those that missed this wild story, I'm shocked that you're at this podcast. So wild turn of events. So what happened was, we haven't podcasted since the Rudy Gobert thing, right, Brian? I think that's correct. Okay, so I don't believe we've said this on air. So what happened was, obviously the coronavirus, it was starting to break out, and I was seeing people I respected saying there was a very good chance that we were going to see empty arenas for NBA games. That was being floated. And so the NBA started taking minimal precautions. So for instance, they were doing things like closed locker rooms, and having the reporters be a safe distance from the players. Rudy Gobert thought this was a joke, and during a press conference at the end, rubbed his hands all over all of the microphone equipment and the table, and then allegedly back on everything in the locker room when it was all done. And then, of course, 2 days later, Rudy Gobert is questioned to play with illness. And then right before tip-off, it is announced that Rudy Gobert has coronavirus, and the game is stopped right before tip-off. The NBA keeps the games that are already going on. It almost starts the Sacramento Kings game. However, it turns out, and I was researching this like in real time, the referee in the last game with the Utah Jazz, the referee that was going to ref the Sacramento Kings game was in the game against the Utah Jazz that had Rudy Gobert in it. So luckily the NBA decided to call that game as well. And then shortly thereafter, the NBA got shut down. Like they basically said they were shutting down temporarily, and then it looks like they're shut down for an elongated period. And I don't think they'll be back. And we'll see if I talk the last why I don't think that'll happen here or in relation. So all of that happened, and Rudy Gobert has, of course, become a pariah since then because he was very flippant with it. And then Donovan Mitchell tested positive as well. And we've gotten a bunch of NBA players, including now like Kevin Durant as an example. I have not even kept up, Brian, at this point. But so the NBA shuts down, and then, of course, a very real question is, well, what all of these workers that were expected to work the remainder of the regular season, what happens to their pay? And some NBA players, including Zion, have stepped out and said they're going to pay. And first off, that's frustrating in that most NBA teams, I think all of them, they're owned by billionaire groups, if not an outright billionaire. So the Warriors, I don't think Lacob is officially a billionaire unless you count the Warriors asset as part of his portfolio. But of course, the group that he is a part of that purchased the Warriors for $440 million back in the day is worth over $1 billion. So
many times worth more than any player, for one thing. That's the important part.
So it is very frustrating when players have to kind of step up to the plate to pay the workers that they already should. And the reason this piece applies is when the NBA season shut down, I was actually very upset. And I actually did end up writing a piece. And interestingly enough, it was focused on the Warriors. And this story gets even wilder because Joe Lacob apparently has a master's degree essentially in epidemiology, which is, like the study of spread of disease, and was quoted in a Forbes article about the NBA shutting things down. And it was such a mind curse word to read because the way he was talking, I'll phrase it, Brian, as politely, and you can tell me if I'm off base here. I was very off-put by how Lacob was describing the situation of the NBA having to be shut down over the coronavirus.
Oh, explain it now. Yeah. Off-putting is a good word. We were chatting about this at the time, but I think the example I used was the Dallas Mavericks, right? Mark Cuban, I'm sure he cares about what was going on, in his front office with all the harassment, but he just didn't care enough to do anything about it until it got, out in the open, right? And I think Lacob's the same way. Like, I'm sure he knew that COVID was going to be bad, but he just didn't prioritize thinking about it. He prioritized the team, whatever other businesses he had. And then once it, was right on his doorstep, he's like, oh, okay, I'm going to do it. So, yeah, I think NBA owners just, they normally don't have to worry about the day-to-day stuff that we regular people do. And I think it took them a while to get dragged along with us.
But I mean, the reason it looks incredibly bad in hindsight, first off, because he has that pedigree, right? Because he's got a master's degree in epidemiology. That's already bad. Then what he said, so here's the quote I put in my article, which just said, when these city health departments and politicians, oh my goodness, when these city health department and politicians make sweeping mandates, whether appropriate or not, they create a lot of inadvertent hardship, unintended consequences. I realize they are trying to protect the populace, but there are consequences. And I said in the article, I think I said on Twitter, I just cannot imagine for the life of me saying that sentence aloud while you're doing PR. And then I believe the Warriors have agreed to pay their workers. I mean, it was kind of it felt alligator tearsy to me because I think Myers was like, oh, the people we feel hardest for are the workers. Um, First ballot box score geeks writer Ethan Sherwood Strauss over the Athletic wrote a fantastic piece about just how poorly the Warriors handled this because essentially they, as he noted, right, they had signs up in front of the door for the last two games before they had to shut down saying, just be warned by coming to see this game. There's a pandemic going on. I don't know if
it wasn't a pandemic yet at that point.
Yeah, they basically said, there's a ongoing worry about the coronavirus. Going to this game could increase your risk of it, and so it's having those signs in front of your arenas and having an owner that has that pedigree looks really, really bad when all is said and done, and then to come out after the fact and say it. So I'm saying you put that full piece together and it looks bad. And another reason it looked bad is that another Forbes piece that came out recently, they have their infamous yearly team valuations where they rank NBA teams in terms of value. And of course, the top two teams are always the Lakers and the Knicks. And this year, the Warriors were number 3. And the reason the Lakers and the Knicks were in front of them was, I think, what Lacob argued in an interview was that that they misallocated the revenue and that he thought the Warriors got more revenue than those two teams. So to just put the full story in line, Lacob brags about how his team makes more money than the top two value teams in Forbes and is like, I think their value of us is wrong because I think we make more money than those two teams. And as I kind of mentioned in the article, and we've been bashing him for the last couple of weeks, if you look at how the team shed contract, right, they unceremoniously traded Andre Iguodala at the start of the season for cap relief. They traded D'Angelo Russell for Andrew Wiggins. Kind of a linear move there, but a side effect of that move was that they got under the hard cap. I think they released some players. So it's like, if I believe they released or traded Willie Cauley-Stein, who was one of the few, like we were like, that's fantastic signing, right? Willie Cauley-Stein was a bargain, and they let him go. So we were like, this team has been like cutting corners, not like a team that you would expect to say they have the top revenue in the NBA. And then they have someone who says he's an expert in diseases, right, with his team saying, hey, there's a risk of you getting a disease on his games right before the league gets shut down because of disease. And then I basically put in this piece, and I think as far as I know, I haven't heard anything to the contrary, that the Warriors are paying their workers. Because when I released this, I was like, they better be paying. I was like, with all of this in front of us, they damn well better be paying their workers. But then what we're still seeing, right, is, like I mentioned, the 76ers today got shamed by Adrian Wojnarowski because they were going to have at-will employees take a 20% pay cut before good guy Joel Embiid stepped up to the plate. Side note, Brian, something we always note on the show, which is just freaking annoying, is we analyze players by how good they are at getting a ball through a hoop, essentially, and getting the ball back. And Joel Embiid has perennially been one of these players that we say is overrated relative to his place in the main zeitgeist. We're not saying he's not a good NBA player. In fact, our numbers have routinely said he's above average, but he's not a top 3 or 5 center in the NBA. He just is that comment you made, sustained greatness, right? His peaks are amazing, right? Joel Embiid is a player that I would not be shocked to see a quadruple double out of him before his career is over, if he can stay healthy. But he has just never had a sustained season of greatness, and this season included, right? Even before this season was shortened because of the coronavirus, he was not going to hit 70 games, and I think probably wasn't going to hit 60 games. And he's never hit 70 games. I think he's hit 2,000 minutes once, barely by the skin of his teeth. So, it's rough where regularly we're like, Joel Embiid is overrated. But then when we talk about some of his Twitter stuff, some of his off-court stuff, some of this, I'm just like, he seems like a good guy. And I have always hated that, right? I've always hated that so many of the players that we bash because they're not good at putting a ball through a hoop are good at other things. As we mentioned early on the show, I think I ran away from it, but like Karl Malone, we agree is one of the greatest players ever. But like I'd take Carmelo Anthony every day of the week and twice on Sunday over Karl Malone if I had to like pick some arbitrary thing, right, for a basketball player, and those were my two choices, like I would just pick Carmelo Anthony, being like, yeah, he's a better guy. I like Carmelo Anthony more.
Yeah, man, it's so tough with the owners. I'll try not to go on for too long on this, but I, I guess the way I look at it is, and I take no pleasure in saying this at all, but I've been running around with my head cut off for the last few years, right? Saying we're in big trouble. We're going to lose our democracy. The oligarchs are taking over, right? And it's kind of cynical. You know, a lot of people didn't think that. They could just go along with their regular day lives because, you know, people had jobs, the economy was okay for a lot of people, and things were fine. But now all of a sudden, I think a lot more people are in my camp. They're, you know, just running around going crazy because they're seeing, you know, what people like us have been seeing for a long time. That here's the way I'll put it. The United States there's always been this duality, right? We probably talked about this on the show before, but there's always two sides to the coin. There's the one side that we talk about in civics class, you know, all men are created equal and liberty and justice and all that stuff. And at times, you know, we have been a country like that have actually believed in that and increased, you know, good rights and whatnot and helped out the citizens. Then the other side of the coin is, you know, the three-fifths compromise, right? Founding the country on slavery, Jim Crow, all this stuff, you know, grinding down the poor, not having health care and all that. And we're up to where we are now, the last, you know, 40 years starting with Reagan, where people have been getting grinded down to the point where when something like a pandemic does hit, they can't just ignore, you know, people trying to loot the government. And the reason I say all this is NBA owners I put into that category. They're going to do what they can. You know, they're going to look for every opportunity to extract everything they can from the economy and from the, you know, machine of the NBA. And they're just going to keep doing it until the curtain gets lifted up, which it has recently. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, wait, people are finally realizing that we've been doing this stuff all along. So I don't think the NBA owners are quite as evil, of course, as, you know, the senators short selling during the pandemic and then lying about it publicly, for instance. But there's still a little bit of that going on, of that, you know, that cynical, instead of all men are created equal, we're going to put ourselves above and try to take everything we can. So that's my left rant right there.
That's so perfect, because what's frustrating is most NBA teams, and the Dallas Mavericks were one of these teams for what it's worth, if I recall, have public funding or financing for their stadiums. Even in some of the best case scenarios, as an example, I believe the Los Angeles Clippers are looking to privately finance a stadium, but
I think it went through today. They officially have bought the Forum now, the LA Forum.
Oh, interesting. Okay, the Clippers.
Yeah, they're gonna build a new stadium where the Forum is.
That is a fast. So they're gonna build like the house of Jerry Buss.
Yeah, in Inglewood. Yep.
That is a weird. I mean, I'm just kind of more like impressed by that move, right? Like, if you're gonna be a rival to the Lakers, like buying their old stadium and building a better stadium than the Staples Arena, I like it. I'll give you props, Ballmer. And they're a little better, right? Because this is, I believe, if I understood it, this is going to be a privately financed stadium, but it's going to be on public land, which is still a problem, right? Because in theory, you could take that public land and build a bunch of houses. As one of the most ludicrous examples in Los Angeles history, for what it's worth, is the Los Angeles Dodgers Stadium is built on top of an old village that basically had a bunch of, I believe, Hispanic people there. And they basically said, oh, we need to upgrade your infrastructure. So they moved everybody out. And the city said, actually, instead of upgrading their infrastructure and moving them back in, what if we just built a baseball stadium? And so it was an example of the government basically seizing common land and taking it from the people. So there are better ways to use common government land than a arena for many, many reasons. And I mean, as people, I don't know how close you've lived to the Oracle Arena. I know we've been near there, but like, I just know as an example.
Yeah, it's only a few miles from my house.
Okay, so I was going to say, anybody that's lived near an arena, a stadium, etc., right, knows that, like, on game day, traffic gets really clogged up, right? Like, it's not good for infrastructure to have just like a peak and valley around you, right? You'd rather prefer consistent, better public transportation we talk about all the time. And stadiums aren't really that conducive for it, right? Because you can't have like regular buses to that area because it's not always in full force, and how it is intermittent, right? Seasons vary in regards to how the leagues schedule them, etc. Um, so that's not the best use of public land, and that's even in the best case scenario. But for many of these, like they get government money to build the stadium, and then they basically use the argument, well, by giving us that money to build the stadium, we are going to help your local economy, right? We're going to put the stadium here, and we're going to create, the bullshit job creator line. We're going to create jobs. We're going to, we're going to help local infrastructure, right? All the people that come to the games are going to do this other things. It's going to be a boost to your economy. And for what it's worth, 85%, and this was years ago, 85% of economists agree that that is not true, that a stadium does not boost your local economy. There are lots of reasons, lots of moving parts. One of the simplest reasons, though, is just replacement cost. I don't know if I'm using the right term, but replacement is the key word, and that should be self-explanatory, just to say, you right now, as you mentioned, with the old Oracle Arena, could go see a Warriors game. And, when they were bad, right, you could probably also get a bargain, right? You could probably go see a Warriors game with some friends, maybe for 10, $15 a ticket for not horrible seats. I wouldn't even be shocked.
That's true. That was true, yeah.
But if hypothetically that arena disappeared and you had $15 in your pocket, and it was a weekday or a weekend rather, it's not like there was nothing else for you to do. You could go see a movie, you could go to a restaurant, you could go bowling, right? And that's the key point. And then I know in some other books, I think Soccernomics is one where they kind of talk this about, say, like the World Cup or Olympics. It's that when you have a big thing, like I just said there, right? If you have an arena that has a bunch of people flock downtown, there were people that were maybe going to go eat downtown or go see a movie downtown or do whatever that now go, oh, I'm going to go elsewhere. So not only is it not the only form of entertainment that people could spend their money on in the local economy, in some places it displaces people from the local economy on big game days. So the net effect is stadiums, arenas do not boost the economy. They don't pay for themselves, right? It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if a billionaire said, hey, I want to build an arena. And you said, okay, well, here's what you do. You buy the land from the government at a premium price. You pay for the arena yourself with your own money. And by the way, very much like a lot of places have to be zoned properly, right? The local government could say, if you're going to build that here, we're going to need you to promise that you have the infrastructure set up to support it. And you're either, you're going to have to pay for it to do that. And then if you do all that, sure, we'll let you.
Yeah, most cities will say if you're going to build a big, corporate headquarters here, you have to also build a bunch of parking, maybe pay for some public transit. You have to, externalities, right, is what they call it. You have to take care of the externalities.
And with arenas, they typically get a pass because the owner says, "Oh, by the way, this arena is gonna help your city," and it never ever does. That's the key. But so you have billionaires that do that basically take public money and they do so with the auspice that they are helping out the economy. And then all you have to wait is for this, right? When things go bad and you go, okay, you claimed you're helping out the economy. In the Warriors case, as we noted in that Forbes article, it was either Forbes, I think it was an Athletic article about the Forbes article. It's like you are claiming that you have made a lot of money off of the team. Now that things are rougher, you're going to help out the local economy. And if the team says, nah, you have to shake your head. And the good news is we're at the point, unlike the president, NBA owners are apparently, most of them seem to have shame, right?
Yep.
Which means you can insult them publicly, and their response to that is to cave and actually do something half decent. But I think, as we've said many times, anytime you look at philanthropy out of billionaires, you just do a percentage and you go, if you were paying not even 1950s tax rates, if you were paying like middle class tax rates on your money, the amount that civics could get from your money is so much more than your philanthropy. And I think you're right when we're saying this pandemic is kind of pulling back the veneer of a lot of this stuff. It's going, I don't believe it's going to happen, Brian, but I really hope people go, listen, these billionaires that claim they're helping the local economy with sports teams, they're not our friends. They're not here to help us. We shouldn't just give them as much leeway as we do. We'll see what happens, though.
Yeah, it's been a process. I mean, we're seeing more and more, cities stand up to these teams, and then less and less cities willing to cave and steal them away. So I think we'll probably keep heading this direction, especially after we come out of this pandemic and however long it takes, the next months or years when our economy is going to be crippled. People are not going to have as much patience for this bullshit. And just on philanthropy in general, I agree with you. It's like instead of, the government, us giving money to the government and telling the government how we want them to spend it, that, it's like the super rich it's like throwing down table scraps to the dogs, and the dogs don't get to even decide what they eat. Some of them might get skipped based on the whims of the philanthropist. Like, it's, let people empower themselves. I'm being a little bit libertarian here, but yeah, philanthropy's bogus.
I mean, a lot of the data kind of just says if you give people money,
That's
if
right.
you just give people direct, it's the best way. And that's actually not an easy problem. One solution I've heard, partial solution, let's be clear. A lot of these things have a lot of moving parts and aren't simple. And that was exactly what you were saying about Michael Lewis's fifth risk at the very top of the show. That is exactly the point, right? A lot of these have a lot of overhead, are not simple, and are boring, right? So that's the worst combination is when you have something that is difficult and boring, right? Because no one wants to do it. It's the 3-and-D player of the NBA that don't get the love they deserve. They kind of are now, but the wrong ones are getting it.
Where's Brandon Clark? Yeah.
You really want to just have the government give people money so that they can live. Like that's the ideal world. The same thing with like healthcare, et cetera, right? And that's boring. And an older thing that I heard the U.S. used to do is the post offices used to be a place that people could basically get money from the government, right? That you could just go to the post office and you could basically double a post office as a place to send postage as well as a place to get paid. And that's not a horrible idea, right? Because when you're looking at things like that are being floated, we'll see how long they stick around. But like universal basic income, I thought pigs were freaking flying, Brian, again to date us. Like Mitt Romney came out and was like, yeah, we need to cut everybody in the United States a check for $1,200. And I was like, what?
I'm going to be
what
cynical, Dre, and say that all these guys know that universal income is a good policy, and they're intentionally withholding it because they're cruel and want to maintain power. So that's my opinion about Mitt Romney. So that said, though, I will take any ally I can right now, but just know that he will not be an ally in the future necessarily, even though he's our ally now.
I was really happy how quickly, again to date us, we're March 24th. So that happened like 2 weeks ago. That happened and I was really confused. And then I was happy how quickly the Republican Party turned around on some of their bills and stuff that they did, because I went, thank God. It's one of those confusing things. I was like, are they sincere? And you can go check the news logs from that time, and it fell apart very quickly. It's exactly what you were saying. Like then when they released how they were going to do it, it was like a really stupid chart and didn't make a lot of sense. So thank goodness that happened. But no, like the universal basic income idea, right? Healthcare as a common good. These ideas, very boring. But to just have the government do that, that's a hard, boring problem, and it's would be nice to just get back to that. And I'm like we said, when we come out of this, here's hoping, because some people seem to be opening up to it, but I do not know, Brian. And I think I've my mantra this year on this show is like, I refuse to show any optimism, and this year keeps proving me right.
This is the crossroads right now. There's several branching paths we can go down in the U.S. Most of them are really bad, but some are better than others, and we're going to see what happens over the next month or so.
So again, if you're in the desolate wastelands of the future and all you managed to find was like someone's old beat up iPod that just happened to have some cached episodes of the Boxscore Geeks show, and that's all you have to listen to, terribly sorry. All right, let's just finish the bad news, Brian, and then let me rant about something. It's why there won't be a 2020 season. So here's the rough part. NBA season got shut down because of coronavirus, and we've just seen the number of players that have tested positive for it go up and up and up. I think I saw Jason Collins today. Like I said, I'm not even keeping track of it. And that's really rough because that keeps pushing back further and further how soon you could start. Even in the ideal world where we were tested and everything could start, at bare minimum, we're like 2 months out for being able to just start, which would already put us past the start. And I'll wash my hands after the show. And I haven't been outside, by the way, for anybody worried about that, because I just touched my face, with apologies. But we're already past the normal playoff start date. So if we stopped the season right now, gave everybody the seed they had, played a normal playoffs, we're already behind schedule, which would set back the off season, which would push back next season already. And that's in the optimistic view where like everything could happen in early April, which I don't buy. And teams, I believe, will rightfully so have arguments and complaints about the fact that hey, the season didn't wrap up properly, right? This isn't like a lockout shortened season that had a set schedule. There are some teams that didn't have what was required, and then additionally, you have some weird scenarios such as the Brooklyn Nets at the moment. I think are like the 6th or 7th seed out east. It's entirely possible if this goes on long enough that Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant are healthy, and I could see some teams going, "This is bullshit. Had we played on normal schedule, they wouldn't have been here in round one. Now we don't want to play them." So you'd have to have some way of deciding how these teams play the playoffs that everybody agreed to. Which I'm just saying that's like juncture point one or pressure point one, right? How you decide who's in the playoffs and what seed is already really, really difficult. And two, we're already out of time, right? We're already behind schedule. So that makes it really rough because any type of play-in tournament, et cetera, is going to add more time on top of that, which we already don't have. Okay, so we got those two things, which is really rough. So let's get to actually, let's say a playoffs happen. I do not buy that we would have shortened playoff rounds or some weird stuff like that because it makes the year too different. The more different the playoffs get, the less likely it is to happen because the more likely it is to be asterisked or teams will complain. And so we're already to this point. Playoffs don't start on time. Now, I meant to ask Larry Kuhn about this, but we're in an interesting position where a lot of playoff teams have expiring deals or player/team options. And the Lakers, for instance, right? I think they have like 3 guaranteed players on their roster. I think most of them are 1-year deals. And Anthony Davis is on a player option for next year. So you run into a funny scenario where if you push back the playoffs too soon, where players' contracts might be expiring, some of those players might have an incentive to hold up the team to go, if you really want to play, if you really want me to play in this playoffs, you better give me a deal for next year or I'm going to sit out. And that makes things really rough. The two best teams in the NBA, the Milwaukee Bucks and Los Angeles Lakers, both have a ton of these, and they're relevant players like Robin Lopez. And I can't believe I said Robin Lopez first, but like George Hill has been playing out of his mind. He's one of the reasons the Bucks massively outperformed our expectations this year. Like George Hill is on an expiring contract there. Like I said, Robin Lopez is one. The Lakers, most of them. So you have this scenario where these contracts would have to be sorted in order for these players to agree to play in the playoffs, and that's already an interesting position. And we've also been hearing rumblings that the NBA some teams may want to not pay full salaries using an act of God provision for the NBA season because it ended early, which means they wouldn't pay out the full contracts. And additionally, the NBA contracts, as we know, are tied to basketball-related income, which is going to go down because the NBA season has been cut. So players are going to be getting paid less than they expected. Owners and managers are going to say, hey, do you still want to play in the playoffs as normal? And the players are going to say, I'm on an expiring deal and you're paying me less than I was expecting to get last year. You're going to have to pony up, which puts a lot of fighting parts together to even happen. And that's even if we get a normal playoffs up, which we're running out of time for all of that to happen. So my general conclusion from all of that is we're not going to see a conclusion to this NBA season, which is really, really rough, but it just kind of is what it is. And in a mean way, I've kind of been watching the bargaining going on NBA Twitter. Fun note, if anybody brings up the point, the stages of grief, that's very much like Dean Oliver's skill curve. So for those who don't know, Basketball on Paper said, here's how I think shooting curves should work. And by that, what he means is, as a player takes more shots, their efficiency should go down. And he said, here's what I think that chart should look like. And if you read the chapter, he goes, this doesn't actually match reality, but this is what I think. And stages of grief, I forget who, I think you beat me to Wikipedia before on shows on this, Brian, but the stages of grief where, it's like anger, denial, bargaining, acceptance, blah, 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 blah. Someone just said, hey, I think that's how people grieve. That's how they get over stuff. And that's not true. A lot of what people do is they can cycle between those emotions. People have different emotions that they go through. They don't necessarily have to go through them in any particular order.
Some people don't get that angry.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've talked about us on this show where I've said my response when I freak out or grieve or whatever is to write silly articles about how the Warriors should pay their players. So is what it is. So yeah, people don't experience the same emotions, but I was seeing a lot of bargaining on Twitter where people were like, oh, let's just have a play-in series, or oh, let's just have a shortened thing. And all of these, here's how I think a playoffs could still happen. And again, I didn't mean to say again. The Simpsons actually had a funny episode on the stages of grief early season, and also one of my favorite Simpsons episodes has Homer cooking a pig, and it gets shot really far, and he keeps saying, this pig is just a little airborne, it's still good. And then it goes in a river, and he says, it's just a little wet, it's still good. And then it gets stuck in the sewer, and he says, it's just a little gummy, it's still good. And eventually Lisa says, it's gone. He goes, I know. And I've kind of been in that position with the NBA season where I'm watching people go, oh, the NBA could still have the 2019, 2020 playoffs. They just need to do this, or they just need to do this. And I think I'm slowly watching people get to that point of going, this season is not going to complete, or if it does, in the best case scenario, it's something bizarre, which I don't believe. Like, that's the other problem is I don't think they're going to want a playoffs or regular season that is that far out of the norm. So if it comes down to starting a short, it might even be shortened, Brian, because we're hearing 12 to 18 months of social distancing, et cetera. We might not start an NBA season until December of 2021. And if that's the case, they might just start a shortened season there and call this season good.
Yeah, and to support your point, we have reporting yesterday from Ramona Shelburne on Outside the Lines, and her quote is, no matter what, they want to salvage the season. And I agree, it seems like wishful thinking. And the bullet point from your list that I think applies the most is, yeah, the players are going to be exposed still. And look, it's months away, right, theoretically, until they'd want to start the season. But I think when people are talking about anything like this, any situation, they're kind of there's too much bias for what's going on in the present. And what's going on in the present is, things are bad, people are inside, but, we're kind of getting by, right? I don't think people understand yet how bad it's going to get. At least people that haven't been looking at the graphs and the data yet. And, on top of that, we know from past pandemics that, if you get into the summer, which does, warmer temperatures, that does help with transmission a little bit. There's often rebounds in the fall. It's not just a one-part pandemic. It goes in chunks, right? This is going to be a process. And I would be shocked if we get, into the fall and they're ready to start a season. I agree with you.
We have a vaccine. And again, we said we weren't going to talk too much on that. So I've said this. The funny thing is, you're not the first person I've heard say this is going to get worse. And I don't disagree with that take. I don't leave out unknown unknowns, right?
Yeah.
There still could be a real world Deus Ex Machina. Something could still happen. We don't know. But on what we know right now, and in the optimal scenario, I do not see the playoffs happening. And one very simple comparable I have is, so while the NBA was getting shut down, Brian, and all the leagues were shutting down, right? The NFL was already shut. So Major League Baseball said they weren't going to start on time. NBA shuts down. March Madness is still trying to find a way to happen, right? Which makes a lot of sense because that's all their revenue. And
yeah.
At one point, well, March Madness is still on the table, kind of, right? I think all of us were looking, going, there's no way in hell March Madness is going to happen.
No, what they're going to try to do is give eligibility, one more year of eligibility to some of those players.
Is what it is. But I was going to say, well, that's really fascinating for like some senior players. Let me speak on that at the end, because that's an interesting side effect that this is going to have as well. But March Madness was still on the table. Duke and Kansas came out and said, we're shutting it down, right? And as soon as that happened, I went, I don't give a blank what the NCAA says.
It took them several days after that, didn't it?
Yeah, that's but I was saying, even I was saying they can wait as long as they want, but it's over, right? You're not having March Madness without, the two of your marquee top-seeded names. And to all of those moving parts I just pointed out in terms of salary negotiations, et cetera, like I said, two of the most vulnerable squads are the Lakers and the Bucks. And I could see LeBron, let's say hypothetically, we got, let's say like Dwight Howard, JaVale McGee, Rajon Rondo, at least one other player. Like I said, Anthony Davis, right? So let's say Anthony Davis goes, listen, I'm not signing my player option. I don't think you have a good enough squad. And the Lakers were probably in a position where they could do what they've done every year, right? They signed veterans for very low amounts, but because they're still stuck with the roster they have, right? If we're trying to finish the 2020 season, and let's say Dwight Howard and Rajon Rondo say, hey, you want us to play in the playoffs, you better pony up, right? We already took a pay cut this year. Let's say that happens and Anthony Davis says, I'm not opting in um, if you overpay those guys. And LeBron James recognizes wisely, he's like, well, I'm not going to play in the playoffs. LeBron James said he wasn't playing in the 2020 playoffs. Does the NBA still really do it, right? And there are a couple players on teams that have the weaknesses I'm discussing right there that have the clout to say, I'm not going to play. And if they say they're not going to play and the NBA tries to put it on, like it is funny because I think it reminds me very much of the response to coronavirus where they tried to keep going on in spite of it. It will look bad and I think fall apart. And I think the number of moving parts that are required to not only get working but to work in harmony to get the 2020 season playoffs to happen, I just don't see that happening. I could be wrong. I'm happy to be wrong, but I'm gonna bet against it at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, just to be more pessimistic here, 'cause, yeah, that's my role today, I guess. So the reason we know that Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell tested positive is because the two players themselves came out and said it, and Gobert apologized and whatnot. There are at least two Lakers players that have been identified as having COVID but have not admitted publicly, so we don't know who they are. I mean, it could be. What if it's LeBron and Anthony Davis, and they end up having diminished lung capacity and can't play 40 minutes anymore? Like that's something that happens. Even if you're young and get it, you can have permanent lung damage from COVID. What if it's JaVale McGee who has asthma as a previous symptom? It could be even worse for him. So, again, like we don't even know if players are going to be medically able to play in the next, 12 months.
If that is rough. I am going to cut this out, Brian. The last piece, we'll just put a pin in it and say we'll come back. The good news is we should have time because I believe it'll still be going on as of next week. But because so many sports are canceled, we were going to complain about chess. And right now, the qualifier for the 2021, I think, or 2020, I forget which, but for the upcoming World Chess Championship is going on. And I want to complain about how it's stupid, but it's called the Candidates Tournament. You can look it up. It's got some upsets right now. The two favorites are currently far from the top, but it's still got a long ways to go. But in the future, I will complain about chess yet again. But I figure, we had our bad news sandwich, Brian. We've talked easily over an hour, much longer because you were doing some amazing behind the scenes stuff. Pull off the veneer of the show. I've used veneer a bunch. Maybe I'll use that in the title, Brian. But you were troubleshooting to get everything working because like Twitch wouldn't let us on.
Twitch is overcrowded. It looks like right now we couldn't stream on Twitch.
But looks like we've done good. So I'll let that be our show. What I was gonna say, in lieu of shoutouts, I called it "What Else Is On," meaning with so many sports off and us being fans around here, do you have anything else that you would recommend watching right now for anybody looking for a show to binge watch or enjoy? I have some suggestions. I'll let you go first, then I'll go second. That'll be our show.
Yeah, I've been watching some TV. I just caught up on Vikings, which is a ridiculous show. I don't necessarily recommend it, but to some people maybe. But actually, the show that I did watch is The Expanse, a great science fiction show that many people think is like the best science fiction, property out there, and it was pretty good. So if you like science fiction and have not seen The Expanse, I recommend it. There's a new season out right now, or a few months ago.
And I'm going to give two podcasts. As always, I recommend the Unpopular Opinion podcast. You can subscribe to their Patreon, $5 a month, and he does like a daily show. It's pretty good, although rough part, he's in LA and he had to shut down his studio because, was worried about coronavirus. Obviously, if you've got a studio where you record your podcast or more professional and you have regular guests that come in, you kind of have to shut that down. You can't really have a rotating slew of stand-up comedian guests if you want to.
Yeah, everyone has to, scumbag it up on Skype like we do. Welcome to our world, Dre. All the big podcasts.
I've been in our world for a while. It's fine. Weather's good. So the Unpopular Opinion podcast and Gamefully Unemployed, they had two particular shows. One of them is free, one you have to sign up for, but one is Jeff and Tom Watch Batman. So Jeff May and Tom Ryman watch a bunch of old Batman, the movies, the animated TV shows, and talk about it. It's a heck of a lot of fun to listen to if you're just a fan of Batman. And then they also had a free series where they did all of the episodes or all of the movies in the Highlander series. They have a podcast and all of that. I think it's called the Princes of the Universe podcast. And that was a lot of fun too. So, unpopular opinion, Gamefully Unemployed, fantastic things to listen to. And then a bummer, right? Because this is the point. Everything's getting shut down. We heard Mental Samurai was going to get renewed for season 2. And I think they're going to rerun season 1. So you might get to hear me seem amazingly prescient about what's going to happen this week on Mental Samurai, which friend of the show Chris Ye was on, because they at least got renewed, so that's good news. We are big fans of the show, but unfortunately, can't tell you to go out and watch it because I'm willing to bet they're going to stop. I don't believe they had done full filming on it yet, so I can't believe they'll release a new season.
Yeah, we're going to be seeing reruns for a while, I think, on most shows. That's what I've been noticing.
And every week, you and I will have some suggestions on what people can watch or listen to. So start thinking for next week, Brian.
Okay.
This has been the Boxscore Geek Show. If you found us not through the website, you can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. We go live usually Tuesday, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, if it's available, twitch.tv/Nerd Numbers. If not, we have a YouTube channel Nerd Numbers, and of course, the recaps will also be on YouTube. Of course, we have a podcast. You can find it on iTunes and Stitcher, the Boxscore Geek Show. I've been your host, Dre Alvarez, found most places as Nerd Numbers. Co-host Brian Foster, found on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Just have a week. Hopefully, I don't know.